Hello! This tutorial video will be covering how to curate Shockwave games by using Flashpoint Core. I am Tommy Shadow, and I will be your guide to Shockwave curation. We will also be discussing specific scenarios and bugs that may occur. The information in this video is recent to Flashpoint Core 2, or as of December 10th, 2018. Firstly, to avoid any confusion, this guide is going to be covering the Shockwave platform, not Flash. You should refer to this guide if you have a file with a DIR, DXR, or DCR type. It is not applicable for files with an SWF type, which are Flash, not Shockwave. I recommend that you become familiar with Flash curation before attempting to curate Shockwave games, as I will be assuming you already know the Flashpoint curation basics. I will also be assuming a basic understanding of HTML code at certain points in this video. Let's begin. The Flashpoint Core 2 preview introduced a new exciting way to curate Shockwave games. This is good news because curating Shockwave games is becoming faster and simpler. Curating for Shockwave no longer requires any third-party software. Rather, everything can be done simply via the command line. This is all thanks to the new Shockwave Projector Redirector, or SPR for short. It works in tandem with the Flashpoint Redirector technology that recreates the game's original environment. This video will be covering what that is and how to use it. Unlike with Flash, Shockwave games are never curated by opening files in the browser. Instead, all Shockwave games must be played using the aforementioned SPR. This can introduce some difficulties, but first, let's look at how to make the most basic Shockwave curation. Here, I have the Flashpoint Core 2 folder on the left. On the right, I have a file that I would like to curate for the game Ride the Wave. To begin, let's go into the Games folder included with Core 2. Now, just like with Flash curation, you will go into the Flash folder, and then htdocs. If it doesn't already exist, we create a folder for the domain on which the game was found. I will create one for wonka.com, since that's where this file is from. There does exist a local SW folder, but like with local Flash, its use is discouraged except for testing purposes. Now that we created a folder for the file to live in, let's copy-paste it there. Now that our game is ready to be added to the Flashpoint launcher as a new game, let's take a moment to go back up to the Games folder included with Core 2. You'll notice that in addition to the regular Flash folder, there also exists a folder for Shockwave. If we take a peek inside, you will see 5 more folders called Games, PJ851, PJ101, PJ1159, and PJ12. The Games folder is only here for legacy reasons, and you should not use it unless you're instructed to by a mechanic. Let's look at what's inside the PJ101 folder. You'll notice that this folder has 2 executable files. One is called Projector, and the other is called SPR. You should not use Projector unless instructed to by a mechanic. The executable called SPR is the one we will be using as our launch command in the Flashpoint launcher. In fact, you'll notice that each of the PJ folders has an SPR executable file. As you may have guessed by now, each of these represents different versions of the same software. It is recommended that you use version 10.1 for most purposes. If when testing your game you get an error saying the file is too new, then try version 11.5.9. If it is still too new, then try 12. Version 8.5.1 should be rarely used, but some of the oldest games require it, such as any of the 3D Groove games. So now, let us create a new game. First, open Flashpoint Launcher. And click Browse, then New Game. For now, let's just enter a title, developer, and the platform, Shockwave, as the metadata. Now for the launch command, Let's try with version 10.1. We begin, like normal, by typing games, and then a backslash, and now we type Shockwave, and another backslash. Now we type the folder representing the version we want to use. Let's try PJ10.1. That means we will be using version 10.1, usual version to try with first. Now we type another backslash, and finally we type in SPR. On the line below, we will be typing the arguments to use. The first argument is always the path to the game. Let's type, in quotes, wonka.com/ride_the_wave.dcr. Now we will save our edits and test the game by double-clicking it. As you can see, it works. This is the most basic curation process, but some games will run into issues. Let's look at the troubleshooting process. Suppose, for example, that there is a Shockwave game that would normally attempt to trigger a view counter, so the game's website can say how many people have played the game. One way for a game programmer to implement this would be to call a JavaScript function on the page the game is embed on. However, if the game is playing in SPR rather than a browser, this will cause a blank browser window to open so that it is able to run a JavaScript function. This is an undesirable behavior that goes against typical user expectations. In order to bridge the gap and allow Shockwave games to work as if they were playing in the browser when in reality they aren't, you can pass a variety of command line arguments to SPR. In this case, the --disable go to net page argument would be helpful for us. This will prevent the game from opening browser windows. However, it will also prevent the game from navigating to legitimate websites such as miniclip.com. So you shouldn't use this argument unless you need to. We will see how arguments are used later in this video. If you were previously curating Shockwave games using the old, outdated method, you might be familiar with the name disable go to net page. This is because it is one of the handlers exported by the Leech Protection Removal Help Extra. Indeed, all of Leech Protection Removal Help's handlers are now available as command line arguments. For those of you who are new to Shockwave curation, let's have a look at what these do for us.
This is Adobe Director. This is the tool that is used by programmers to create Shockwave games. You won't need a copy of this, but I am going to use it to demonstrate what we're doing when we curate a Shockwave game. Here I've created a script that displays the string Hello World in an alert box. Let's see what that looks like. As you can see, an alert appears with the Hello World text inside. Now I am going to change the script so that the alerts will display the value of the run mode property. In the official Adobe documentation, we can see that the run mode is a property which can have one of three string values: author, projector, or plugin. It will be author if I am currently using director, which, as you can see, I am. Let's see that in action. As you can see, the run mode is set to the string author. If I were playing this in the browser, the run mode would instead be plugin. Here is the result of the same script running in the browser. Here, we can see the same script running in a projector. In a projector, the run mode would be projector. Any Shockwave game could access this property. This could be problematic, since a game is able to tell if it is playing offline instead of in the browser. Normally, the run mode is a read-only property that cannot be changed. In previous Flashpoint versions, my Leech Protection Removal Help code allowed curators to change this. If I now call setTheRunMode, a custom handler I created, with the argument plugin before displaying our alert, you will see that the value of the run mode changes. As you can see, the run mode is now set to a value it is not normally supposed to be.
It used to be that in order to curate Shockwave games, you needed to have Director in order to call these handlers before the game starts. However, curation can now be done entirely by using the command line. Let's see how we could change the run mode for a game that needs it. The game Hannah and the Ice Caves requires that the run mode be set to plugin, since it is only intended to run in the browser. Let's go into edit mode. Look at its command line argument. As you can see, we use the argument -- set the run mode, and following that argument is a string in quotes which says plugin. This will make the game believe it is playing in the browser, even though it isn't. There are 18 arguments you can use in total. Many of them are to be followed by strings or integers, separated from the argument by a space. Old Shockwave curators used to using leech protection removal help may notice two arguments they are not familiar with: --do and --go. Let's take a look at a use case for each of these arguments. The first argument is -- set the movie path. This argument is of reduced usefulness now that the redirector is used for Shockwave curations. It allows you to change the path where the game believes it is playing. This was primarily useful when the redirector wasn't in use, because games could be convinced they were playing on a particular website without the redirector. However, you could still potentially use -- set the movie path for some purposes, because this argument supersedes the redirector. For example, the redirector cannot redirect HTTPS websites, so if there were a game that only runs if it detects it's on an HTTPS website, you could write -- set the movie path with the string https://example.com with a trailing slash, to make the game believe it is on an HTTPS website. However, I have yet to see any game do this. Movie paths should always have a trailing slash. The next argument is -- set the movie name. This makes the game believe it has a different file name than it actually does. This exists purely as a sister handler to set the movie path, though I have yet to see an actual use case for it. The next argument is -- set the environment _ shock machine. Shockwave.com had a product called Shock Machine, which allowed you to play their games offline. Some games would only be willing to play offline if being played in the Shock Machine. You can use this argument with the integer 1 or 0 to convince the game that it is or is not playing in Shockwave.com's Shock Machine. Alongside that argument exists -- set the environment _ shock machine version. This is to be used with a string with the version of Shockwave.com's Shock Machine. The next argument is -- set the platform. This can be used to convince the game it is playing on a Mac when it is actually playing on Windows or vice versa. Again, this is simply an option available to you on the off chance that playing the game on a particular OS incites some undesirable behavior. Possible values are Windows, 16, Windows, 32, or Mac, PowerPC. The number of bits is based on whether the projector is a 16-bit or 32-bit executable, not the OS architecture. The next argument is -- set the run mode. This is the argument I briefly explained at the beginning of this video. It allows you to make the game believe it is playing in the director interface, in a projector, or in the browser, regardless of where it is actually playing. Sometimes a game will check if this is set to plugin, if the game is not intended to run outside of the browser. In this case, you will want to use this argument, followed by the plugin string. In other cases, games will disable their site lock entirely if the run mode is set to author, in order to not get in the way of development. Setting the run mode to author also sometimes enables other cheats or developer shortcuts. This is one of the first arguments you should play with if a game is refusing to work. The next argument is -- set the environment _ product build version. This allows you to convince the game it is playing on a different product build version of the software than it actually is. Alongside it is set the product version, which allows you to convince the game it is on an entirely different software version altogether. This is seldom useful for curators, but it's an option at your disposal. Similar to set the platform is -- set the environment _ OS version. This allows you to set the OS version the game believes it is playing on. For example, you could set this to the string Windows XP or Windows Vista. Also similar is -- set the machine type. This is an obsolete property that was replaced by the platform. It is an integer from 0 to 256, with any integer from 0 through 255 meaning a Mac machine is being used, and 256 meaning a Windows machine is being used. You can use this with very old games in place of set the platform. The next argument is -- force the exit lock. Notice the use of the word force instead of set. This is because, unlike the previous arguments which don't actually change anything about the environment, but rather only tell scripts that the application has a different state, force the exit lock actually does change the exit lock. The exit lock is a property in Director that determines whether or not the application will actually close when the user clicks the close button of the window or hits escape. This is intended to be used to display an "Are you sure you want to quit?" message, but all too often it is simply left on by accident, preventing the game from closing. To force the exit lock off, use this argument with the integer 0. This argument is another one that sees a lot of common use. In a similar vein, -- force the safe player forces on or off the safe player property. If set to 1, this disables a number of quote-unquote unsafe functionalities of Director, such as the ability to edit files or copy to the clipboard. Forcing this to 0 will leave it permanently off. If you wish to force this to 1 for whatever reason, you should use this argument last, as it will also prevent the other arguments from working. One particularly useful argument is -- set external param. To understand what this does, let us look at the HTML embed code of a Shockwave game. Here we can see the embed code for the game Nabisco World Mini Golf. Notice that there are some odd param tags here. In addition to the normal tag with the name source, you also see ones named SW1, SW2, and so on. These are parameters that are being passed from the web page to the game. These cannot normally be set outside of the browser. However, set external param allows you to. The argument is followed by the name, then the value as strings. Here, we set SW1 to http://oneweakness.com, so that the game will believe said param tag exists in the browser it is supposedly playing in. You can use this argument multiple times with different strings to set multiple external params. Some games also check if the value of the source param is an absolute URL, since if it is, it could mean the game is being hotlinked. Therefore, we can set the theoretical source attribute, like in this example. So, having the game's embed code can be important to its proper curation. Two handlers that are similar to each other are -- disable GoToNet movie and -- disable GoToNet page. These both disable abilities of games. Disable GoToNet page was briefly discussed at the beginning of this video. It disallows the game from opening any web page in the browser. This is useful for disallowing the game from opening JavaScript URLs. Disable GoToNet movie is a sister function to this, and prevents the current movie from going to other online movies. These arguments are not followed by any strings or integers. The last of the arguments returning from the old method of doing things is -- bugfix Shockwave 3D bad driver list. Adding this argument fixes a crash that occurs with Shockwave 3D games on NVIDIA graphics cards. Flashpoint actually does this automatically for you in every game in case you forget, but it's a good idea to add this argument to 3D games in case that behavior ever changes. This argument is not followed by any strings or integers. Finally, we have two arguments that are new to the redirector projectors. These are --do and --go. --do is one of the most powerful arguments you can use. --do allows you to run lingo code in the scope of the game being curated after it has been loaded. Let's see this in action and use it to display our Hello World alert from earlier. As you can see here, When SPR is started with this do argument, an alert will appear to say, "Hello world." Note the use of single quotes to substitute double quotes as to not interfere with the argument. You can also use the --do argument multiple times to execute multiple lines of code. If not set, the default is to do nothing. --go simply selects a frame to go to in the movie. To put it simply, like Flash, Shockwave games use the concept of frames in a movie to represent different points in the game. If not set, the default is to start at the beginning. Now that you know all the arguments and what they do, let's take an opportunity to look at some specific use cases and how games for certain publishers are to be properly handled. eZone games will sometimes have trial features that only activate offline. However, rather than automatically detecting if they're online or offline, eZone games use the eZone control parent script in order to keep track of this state. As such, you should use my eZone control wrapper to circumvent this, which will automatically activate all features. This wrapper will be pinned in the Shockwave chat channel in the Flashpoint Discord, and is called wrapper_ezo.dcr. You will need to download this file and put it in your game's folder. Note that when you are creating the game folder, the domain name for it must be www.ezone.com and not just ezone.com. In other words, the www is necessary. You don't need to make any edits to the wrapper, just put it into your game's folder and load it like normal using SPR, using the command --do with the string member and then opening bracket and a single quote, game name, another single quote, closing bracket, dot text equals, and then your game name, in my case, space.dcr. The DCR file extension is required. Robot Duck Games uses security PHP file to check if the game is allowed to play or not. You don't need to know much about how this works, just copy an existing security file into your game folder. You will also need to paste in a folder called System, which has another security.php file inside. Then you'll need to use a specific external param, which will be pinned. You'll always want to set the run mode to plugin with Robot Duck, and sometimes you'll want to use disable go to net page, since some games suffer the JavaScript URL problem. Older Robot Duck games also require forcing the exit lock off. You should use version 10.1 like usual for Robot Duck games. Like with eZone, when creating the domain folder for Miniclip, the domain must be www.miniclip.com and not just miniclip.com. In other words, the www is again necessary. Silent Bay Studios games are a particular case because their loader is actually not just a loader. It also has some common scripts their games use, so you have to keep the loader along with the rest of the game and put it in your game folder. Like with eZone, there is a wrapper for Silent Bay Studios games called wrapper_Silent Bay Studios. This needs to go in your game folder as well. There's also a file called advert_loader.swf that you will also need to put in your game folder. Like with eZone, you do not need to make any edits to the wrapper. Load it like normal using SPR, and this time use the --do argument with the string shown on screen. Substitute the given URL for the original URL to the main game file. Do not forget to include the www at the beginning, which is not optional. Use version 11.5.9 for Silent Bay Studios games. That's it for this curation guide. Now you should be ready to take on Shockwave game curation for Flashpoint. If you encounter any issues, feel free to ask for help on the Discord chat, and a mechanic should be able to point you in the right direction. Good luck!